Welcome to Bedtime Express, your nightly journey to peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're traveling back to medieval Scotland to discover the remarkable story of William Wallace, not just the legendary warrior you might know from movies, but the thoughtful dreamer, dedicated scholar, and reluctant guardian who became one of history's most inspiring figures. You're about to hear the complete tale of William's transformation from a curious boy wandering the Scottish countryside to the eternal guardian of freedom and justice. This is a story of courage, love, sacrifice, and the power of standing up for what you believe in, even when the odds seem impossible. Before we begin this journey together, please take a moment to like this video. If you're enjoying Bedtime Express, leave a comment about your favorite historical figure, and don't forget to subscribe for more soothing bedtime stories that help you drift off to peaceful dreams. Now, find your most comfortable position. Take a deep breath and let your body begin to relax. Close your eyes if you'd like and prepare to be transported to the rolling hills of 13th century Scotland, where our story begins. Sweet dreams await. William Wallace, The Guardian's Journey. In the gentle rolling hills of Renfrewshire, where the morning mist clings to ancient oaks like whispered secrets, there lived a boy whose dreams would one day reshape a nation. William Wallace was born not into the thunder of battle, but into the quiet rhythm of rural Scottish life, where the seasons turned as they had for countless generations before. The year was 1270, and Scotland breathed freely under the reign of Alexander III. In those days, the kingdom stretched from the wild highlands to the fertile lowlands, united and prosperous. Young William's world was one of stone cottages with thatched roofs, where smoke curled lazily from chimneys and the sound of cattle lowing echoed across green pastures. His father, Malcolm Wallace, was a minor noble, a man whose hands were as comfortable holding a quill as they were gripping a sword's hilt. Malcolm possessed that rare quality of being both learned and practical, a dreamer grounded in reality. He would often sit by the hearth in the evening, the firelight dancing across his weathered face as he spoke to his sons about the old ways, the ancient customs that bound their people together like threads in a tapestry. A man's true strength, Malcolm would say, his voice soft yet carrying the weight of conviction, lies not in his ability to conquer others, but in his capacity to understand them, to see the world through their eyes, while never losing sight of his own truth. These words would echo in William's mind long after his father's voice had faded into memory. William's mother, whose name has been lost to the whispers of time, was a woman of gentle wisdom. She possessed that intuitive understanding that mothers often have, seeing in her youngest son a spirit that burned brighter than most. While his older brother John seemed content to follow the expected path of a lesser nobleman, William's eyes held questions that reached beyond the borders of their small estate. As a child, William would often wander the countryside surrounding Elderslie, his bare feet finding purchase on moss-covered stones as he explored the ancient forests that had witnessed the rise and fall of forgotten kingdoms. He was drawn to the old places, the standing stones that marked boundaries older than memory, the circles where druids once gathered under starlit skies, the burial mounds that held the remains of warriors whose names had been claimed by time. In these quiet moments of solitude, young William felt a connection to something larger than himself. It was not yet the fierce patriotism that would later define him, but rather a deep, almost mystical awareness of the land itself. He could feel the pulse of Scotland in the earth beneath his feet, hear its voice in the wind that swept across the moors, see its dreams reflected in the still waters of Highland lochs. The boy's education began, as was proper for a nobleman's son, with the fundamentals of reading and writing. But William showed an unusual aptitude for learning that surprised even his tutors. He devoured books with the same enthusiasm that other boys his age showed for games and sports. The stories of ancient heroes captured his imagination, tales of Arthur and his knights, of Charlemagne and his paladins, of Alexander the Great and his conquests. Yet it was not the glory of conquest that fascinated William, but rather the ideals these heroes represented. He was drawn to stories of justice defended, of the weak protected from the strong, of men who stood alone against impossible odds because they believed in something greater than themselves. In the flickering candlelight of the castle's modest library, young William began to understand that true heroism was not about winning battles, but about choosing to fight them in the first place. His uncle, Sir Ronald Crawford, was the Sheriff of Ayr, a man of considerable learning who recognized in his nephew a mind that hungered for knowledge. During long summer visits to Crawford's estate, William was exposed to a wider world of ideas and philosophies. Sir Ronald had traveled extensively in his youth, visiting the great centers of learning in Paris and Rome, and he brought back with him not just books, but stories of how different peoples lived and governed themselves. Power, Sir Ronald would explain as they walked through his extensive gardens, is like water, William. In the hands of the wise, it nourishes and gives life. In the hands of the foolish or corrupt, it destroys everything it touches. These conversations planted seeds in William's young mind, ideas about governance, justice, and the proper relationship between ruler and ruled that would later bloom into revolutionary thought. As William grew from boy to young man, his physical presence began to match the intensity of his spirit. He was tall for his age, with the kind of natural strength that came from a life spent outdoors. His hair was the color of autumn leaves, and his eyes held depths that seemed to see beyond the immediate moment into possibilities that others couldn't imagine. but it was his voice that people remembered most, clear and resonant, carrying an authority that seemed to come from some inner wellspring of certainty. The young Wallace was not without his share of youthful adventures and mishaps. He once spent an entire night lost in the Caledonian forest, following what he was certain was the call of some ancient spirit, only to discover at dawn that he had been pursuing nothing more mystical than a particularly persistent owl. Another time, he attempted to build a raft to sail across Loch Lomond, convinced that he could reach the sacred isle of Inchcailloch, where ancient druids were said to have practiced their mysteries. The raft sank within sight of shore, and William had to be rescued by local fishermen who found him clinging to a piece of driftwood, still maintaining that his calculations had been perfectly sound. These adventures, while occasionally embarrassing, served to deepen William's connection to the Scottish landscape and its people. He learned to read the subtle signs of weather in cloud formations, to identify edible plants in the wild, to navigate by the stars on moonless nights. More importantly, he learned to trust his instincts, to listen to that inner voice that would later guide him through moments when rational thought alone would not suffice. The Scotland of William's youth was a land of contrasts and contradictions. In the lowlands, where the Wallaces made their home, life was relatively peaceful and prosperous. Farmers tended their fields, merchants plied their trades, and scholars debated questions of theology and philosophy in monastery schools. But to the north, in the wild highland regions, ancient clan loyalties still held sway, and the old ways of warfare and honor remained very much alive. William was fascinated by these highland customs, so different from the more refined ways of lowland nobility. During occasional journeys north with his father, he would listen with rapt attention to the songs of Highland bards, epic tales of clan battles and ancient feuds that stretched back generations. These stories spoke to something primal in William's nature, a recognition that beneath the veneer of civilization lay older, more fundamental truths about loyalty, honor, and the willingness to die for one's beliefs. Yet, even as he was drawn to these martial traditions, William's deeper nature inclined toward peace and learning. He preferred lengthy discussions about philosophy to mock battles with wooden swords. He would rather spend an afternoon reading Aristotle than practicing archery. This bookish tendency sometimes earned him gentle mockery from his peers, but William seemed unconcerned with their opinions. He was already learning one of life's most important lessons, that a man must be true to his own nature, regardless of what others expect or demand. As William approached his 16th year, his father began to speak seriously about the boy's future. The Wallace family, while minor in the grand hierarchy of Scottish nobility, possessed enough wealth and connections to provide their son with opportunities that most young men of his generation could only dream of. Malcolm Wallace had long believed that true education required exposure to the wider world beyond Scotland's borders. and he began to make arrangements for William to study abroad. The decision was not made lightly. To send a son away to foreign lands was always risky, particularly in an age when travel was dangerous and communication uncertain. But Malcolm recognized that his youngest son possessed gifts that deserved cultivation in the finest schools Europe had to offer. William's quick mind, his facility with languages, and his insatiable curiosity about the world marked him as someone who might one day play an important role in Scotland's future. The night before William was to depart for his studies abroad, father and son sat together in the family's modest solar, watching the last light of summer fade across the Renfrewshire hills. Malcolm spoke quietly of his hopes and fears for his son, of the dangers and opportunities that lay ahead. But most importantly, he spoke of the responsibility that came with privilege and education. "Remember always, my son," Malcolm said, his hand resting gently on William's shoulder, "that knowledge without wisdom is like a sword without a hilt, dangerous to all who would wield it. Learn all that you can, but never forget that true learning should make us more humble, not more proud. And never forget that you are, first and always, a son of Scotland. Whatever you become, wherever your path may lead, that truth should guide every decision you make." As dawn broke over Elderslie the following morning, William Wallace set out on the journey that would transform him from a dreamy country boy into one of history's most compelling figures. He carried with him few possessions, some clothes, a small purse of coins, and a leather-bound copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that had been his grandfather's. But he also carried something far more valuable, a set of ideals and principles that had been shaped by his upbringing in the peaceful Scottish countryside, ideals that would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The boy who had spent his childhood wandering the ancient forests of Renfrewshire, who had dreamed by Highland lochs and learned wisdom at his father's knee, was about to discover that the world beyond Scotland's borders was far more complex and dangerous than anything he had yet encountered. But he was also about to discover strengths within himself that he never knew he possessed, and to begin the long journey that would eventually lead him back home, forever changed but never broken. The road from Scotland to the continent was long and treacherous in those days, winding through English territories where a young Scot might find himself unwelcome, then across the choppy waters of the Channel to the alien shores of France. William Wallace made this journey in the company of other young noblemen bound for foreign universities, but even among this learned group he stood apart, quieter than most, more observant, possessed of an intensity that seemed to burn just beneath the surface of his youthful features. Paris in the year 1286 was the undisputed center of learning in Western Europe. The great university that had grown up around the cathedral schools of Notre Dame attracted students from every corner of Christendom, creating a babel of languages and customs that both thrilled and overwhelmed the young Scottish scholar. As William first walked through the narrow streets of the left bank, breathing in the mingled scents of ink, parchment, and unwashed humanity, he felt as though he had stepped into a different world entirely. His lodgings were modest, a small chamber in a building that housed a dozen other foreign students, with barely enough room for a bed, a desk, and a chest for his belongings. The walls were thin, and through them he could hear the constant murmur of scholarly debate in half a dozen languages. At night, when homesickness threatened to overwhelm him, William would lie on his narrow cot and listen to these voices, gradually beginning to distinguish the rhythms of Latin argumentation, the melodic flow of Italian philosophy, the guttural certainty of German theology. The University of Paris in those days was divided into 4 faculties: arts, canon law, civil law, and theology. William enrolled first in the Faculty of Arts, where all students were required to master the 7 liberal arts that formed the foundation of medieval education. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic came easily to him, for his mind was naturally suited to the parsing of language and the construction of arguments. But it was in the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, that William discovered new realms of beauty and order that he had never imagined. His first master was an elderly French scholar named Master Guillaume de Laris, a man whose love of learning was matched only by his impatience with students who failed to share his passion. Master Guillaume had spent decades studying the works of Aristotle and Aquinas, and he possessed the rare gift of being able to make even the most abstract philosophical concepts seem relevant to daily life. Under his tutelage, William began to understand that philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a practical guide to living a meaningful life. Young Wallace, Master Guillaume would say during their private tutorials, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in contemplation, "You have a mind capable of great things, but mind alone is not enough. Wisdom comes only when thought is married to experience, when the lessons of the schools are tested against the realities of the world. Remember this as you progress in your studies. Knowledge that cannot be applied to the betterment of human life is nothing more than elaborate vanity." The days in Paris followed a rhythm as predictable as the ringing of church bells. Dawn brought the call to morning prayers, followed by lectures in the great halls where masters would read from their texts while students scribbled notes on wax tablets. Afternoons were devoted to disputations, formal debates where students would argue both sides of philosophical questions under the watchful eyes of their professors. Evenings brought private study, the careful copying of texts, and intense discussions that often lasted well into the night. William excelled in these disputations, revealing a natural gift for oratory that surprised even his teachers. His voice, which had been merely pleasant in Scotland, seemed to gain power and resonance in the great halls of the university. When he rose to speak, something in his bearing commanded attention, a quality that went beyond mere confidence to suggest a deeper certainty about the importance of the ideas he was expressing. His fellow students began to seek him out, not just for help with their studies, but for his perspective on the great questions that occupied their minds. Yet, for all his success in the academic arena, William found himself increasingly troubled by the gulf between the ideals discussed in the lecture halls and the realities he observed in the world around him. Paris was a city of stark contradictions. Magnificent cathedrals rose beside hovels where the poor struggled to survive. Learned men debated the nature of justice, while beggars starved in the streets below their windows. The young Scotsman, raised in the relative equality of rural life, was shocked by the extremes of wealth and poverty that seemed to be accepted as natural and inevitable. This awareness deepened during his second year in Paris, when political tensions in the city erupted into violence. A dispute between the university and the city authorities over student privileges led to riots that left several young scholars dead and many more injured. William witnessed these events with the eyes of someone who had never before seen how quickly civilized discourse could degenerate into brutal conflict. The experience left him shaken, but also somehow awakened to the fragility of the social order he had always taken for granted. It was during this period of uncertainty that William first encountered the writings of Thomas Aquinas on the nature of just war and legitimate government. Aquinas argued that rulers derived their authority not from divine right alone, but from their ability to promote the common good of their people. When a ruler failed in this fundamental duty, Aquinas suggested, resistance might not only be permissible, but morally required. These ideas struck William with the force of revelation, providing a philosophical framework for thoughts and feelings he had been unable to articulate. William's third year in Paris brought new challenges and opportunities. He had mastered the basic curriculum and was now free to pursue more specialized studies. He chose to focus on law and political philosophy, subjects that seemed increasingly relevant to the questions that occupied his mind. His new master was an Italian scholar named Maestro Antonio da Siena, a man who had served as an advisor to several European princes and brought to his teaching a practical understanding of how power actually operated in the world. Under Maestro Antonio's guidance, William studied the legal traditions of various European kingdoms, comparing the feudal systems of France and England with the more egalitarian customs of the Italian city-states. He learned about the concept of popular sovereignty that was beginning to emerge in some quarters, the radical idea that political authority ultimately derived from the consent of the governed rather than from divine appointment. These studies opened his mind to possibilities he had never imagined, ways of organizing society that might be more just and more conducive to human flourishing than the traditional feudal hierarchies he had grown up accepting without question. News from Scotland arrived sporadically through letters from his family and conversations with other Scottish students. The reports were troubling. King Alexander III had died unexpectedly, leaving the kingdom in a succession crisis that threatened to tear the country apart. Various claimants to the throne were gathering support, and there were rumors that Edward I of England was positioning himself to intervene in Scottish affairs. William found himself torn between his desire to complete his education and his growing sense that his homeland might soon need every able man it could muster. The decision came suddenly, precipitated by a letter from his father that arrived in the late winter of William's 4th year in Paris. Malcolm Wallace wrote with uncharacteristic urgency about the deteriorating political situation in Scotland and the need for educated men who could help navigate the challenges ahead. But beyond the political concerns, there was something else in his father's letter, a weariness, a sense that time was running short, and that there were things that needed to be said between father and son while there was still opportunity. William's final months in Paris took on a bittersweet quality as he prepared to leave the intellectual paradise that had shaped his thinking and character. He spent long hours in the university library, copying texts that he knew would be difficult to obtain in Scotland. He engaged in one last series of disputations, testing his ideas against the finest minds of his generation. Most importantly, he began to synthesize what he had learned, to understand how the various threads of his education might be woven together into a coherent philosophy of life and leadership. Master Guillaume, now aged and frail, summoned William for a final private conference before his departure. The old scholar had grown fond of his Scottish student, recognizing in him a quality of moral seriousness that was rare even among the most dedicated scholars. As they sat together in the master's study, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of decades, Guillaume offered his final counsel. "You return to a world very different from the one you left," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The learning you have acquired here will be tested in ways that no disputation could prepare you for. Remember that true philosophy is not about winning arguments, but about finding the courage to act on what you believe to be right, even when the cost is high. Trust in the principles you have learned, but trust also in your own heart. Sometimes the greatest wisdom lies not in what we know, but in what we feel must be done." The young man who departed Paris in the spring of 1290 was vastly different from the boy who had arrived 4 years earlier. William Wallace had grown not just in stature, though he now stood well over 6 feet tall, but in intellectual depth and moral conviction. He had been exposed to ideas that challenged every assumption he had grown up with about power, authority, and the proper relationship between ruler and ruled. He had seen how civilization could flourish when knowledge was pursued for its own sake, but also how quickly that same civilization could collapse when injustice and inequality went unchecked. As his ship crossed the channel back toward Britain, William stood at the rail watching the white cliffs of Dover emerge from the morning mist. Somewhere beyond those cliffs lay Scotland, the land of his birth that was now also the testing ground for everything he had learned and become. He carried with him a small library of carefully copied texts, a mind sharpened by years of rigorous study, and a heart filled with ideals that would soon be put to their ultimate test. The boy who had left Scotland 4 years earlier had been a dreamer, full of vague notions about justice and heroism gleaned from ancient stories. The man who now returned was a philosopher warrior in the making, armed with both the intellectual tools to understand the world and the moral conviction necessary to try to change it. He did not yet know that he was destined to become a legend, but he was beginning to understand that some dreams are worth any sacrifice to make them real. The ship carrying William Wallace back to his homeland cut through waters that had witnessed the passage of countless other young men returning from foreign adventures, their heads full of new ideas and their hearts full of hope. Few of them would leave any lasting mark on history, but this particular young man carried within him the seeds of a revolution that would echo through the centuries. The scholar was about to become a guardian, and the guardian would soon discover that the highest form of learning comes not from books, but from the willingness to risk everything for the sake of truth. The Scotland that welcomed William Wallace home in the autumn of 1290 was a nation balanced on the edge of a precipice, though few yet understood how far the fall might be. The golden age of Alexander III seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by uncertainty and fear as various nobles maneuvered for advantage in the succession crisis that followed the death of the child queen, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. The air itself seemed charged with tension, as if the very land was holding its breath, waiting to see which way its fate would turn. William returned to Elderslie to find his family's estate much as he had left it, but the people who inhabited it were changed. His father, Malcolm, though still vigorous, showed the weight of years spent navigating increasingly treacherous political waters. The easy confidence that had characterized the older Wallace was now tempered with a wariness born of watching too many friends choose the wrong side in disputes that seemed to multiply with each passing month. The world has grown more complicated while you were away, my son, Malcolm observed as they walked together through the estate's modest grounds. Every man who calls himself noble now fancies himself a king, maker, and loyalty has become a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a sacred bond between lord and vassal. I fear we are approaching times that will test every principle we hold dear. William found himself both frustrated and fascinated by the political maneuvering that consumed the Scottish nobility. His years in Paris had given him a theoretical understanding of how power operated, but seeing it in practice in his own homeland was a different matter entirely. The great magnates, the Bruces, the Comyns, the Balliols, seemed more concerned with their own advancement than with the welfare of Scotland as a whole. They treated the kingdom like a prize to be won, rather than a trust to be protected, and their short-sighted ambitions would have consequences that none of them seemed able to foresee. It was during this period of political uncertainty that William first began to develop his distinctive philosophy of leadership and governance. Unlike the great nobles who saw authority as something to be grasped and held, William understood it as something to be earned through service. His education in Paris had exposed him to classical ideals of virtue-based leadership, but his Scottish upbringing had taught him that true authority came from the trust of ordinary people rather than from royal appointment or noble birth. The young Wallace spent much of his first year back in Scotland traveling throughout the lowlands, ostensibly managing various family properties, but actually learning about the conditions and concerns of common people. What he discovered troubled him deeply. While the nobles schemed and plotted in their castles, ordinary Scots were struggling with increased taxation, military levies, and the general uncertainty that came from having no clear royal authority to maintain order and justice. In the villages and farms he visited, William found himself naturally taking on the role of mediator and counselor. Peasants who might have been intimidated by other members of the nobility found in young Wallace someone who listened to their concerns with genuine interest and who possessed both the education to understand complex legal issues and the moral authority to broker fair solutions. Word of his fairness and wisdom began to spread, and soon people were seeking him out to resolve disputes that might otherwise have festered into blood feuds. It was through this work that William first began to understand the true nature of the crisis facing Scotland. The problem was not merely political, a question of which claimant had the best legal right to the throne, but fundamental, touching on the very conception of what it meant to be a nation. For generations, Scottish identity had been defined in opposition to external threats, particularly from England. But now, with the kingdom divided against itself, that external threat was beginning to look like salvation to some and conquest to others. The invitation to Edward I of England to arbitrate the succession dispute seemed reasonable to many Scottish nobles at the time. Edward was acknowledged as one of the most skilled diplomats and lawyers in Europe, and his intervention appeared to offer a peaceful resolution to a crisis that might otherwise have led to civil war. But William, drawing on his studies of Roman history and his understanding of how ambitious rulers operated, saw the danger immediately. "A fox invited into the henhouse," he said to his father after news arrived of the noble's decision. will not content himself with arbitrating disputes among the chickens. He will end by devouring them all and will claim it was done for their own protection. The installation of John Balliol as king under Edward's suzerainty confirmed William's worst fears. Here was a Scottish monarch who owed his crown not to the free choice of his people, or even to the machinations of Scottish nobles, but to the approval of a foreign king who clearly viewed Scotland as little more than a northern province of his expanding empire. The humiliation was not merely political but existential. It struck at the heart of what it meant to be Scottish. During the years of Balliol's puppet reign, William established himself as something unique in Scottish society, a nobleman who derived his authority not from royal favour or inherited privilege, but from the trust and respect of ordinary people. He developed a network of contacts throughout the lowlands, men and women who looked to him for leadership not because they were legally bound to do so, but because they believed he genuinely cared about their welfare. This period also saw William's first serious romantic attachment, though the details have been obscured by the mists of time and legend. What we know is that he fell deeply in love with a young woman from a neighboring estate, someone whose beauty was matched by her intelligence and whose gentle nature provided a counterpoint to the increasingly militant direction of his own thoughts. In her company, he could briefly forget the weight of growing responsibility and remember what it felt like to be simply a young man in love. Their courtship took place against the backdrop of Scotland's growing subjugation, lending an urgency and poignancy to their private moments together. They would walk in the evening through the gardens of her father's estate, speaking in low voices about their hopes for the future, both personal and political. She shared his love of learning and his concern for justice, but she also possessed a practical wisdom that helped temper his more idealistic impulses. "Change the world if you must, my love," she would tell him during their long conversations. "But do not let the world change the essential goodness in your heart. The moment you become as hard and calculating as those you oppose, you will have lost the very thing that makes you worth following." Her words proved prophetic, for the events of 1296 would test every principle William held dear, and force him to make choices that would define not only his own fate, but the destiny of his nation. Edward I's invasion of Scotland that spring was swift and brutal, designed not merely to assert English authority, but to break the Scottish spirit once and for all. The sack of Berwick, where thousands of civilians were slaughtered without mercy, sent a clear message about the cost of resistance. William watched from afar as the Scottish nobility crumbled before Edward's advance, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of English military might. John Balliol was stripped of his crown and carried off to London in chains, while the great magnates who had once competed for the throne now competed to see who could submit most abjectly to their new English master. The Stone of Destiny, symbol of Scottish kingship for centuries, was loaded onto English wagons and carried south as a trophy of conquest. But even as the formal structures of Scottish independence collapsed, William began to see signs that the spirit of resistance was not dead but merely driven underground. Common people who had been ignored by the great nobles in times of peace now revealed a stubborn determination to preserve their freedom that surpassed anything shown by their supposed betters. Farmers refused to pay English taxes, merchants declined to take English coins, and young men began to disappear into the forests rather than swear allegiance to Edward's governors. It was in this crucible of national humiliation and popular resistance that William Wallace began his transformation from scholar and mediator into the guardian his people desperately needed. The process was gradual rather than sudden, marked more by quiet conversations in remote locations than by dramatic declarations of intent. He began to see himself not as a nobleman with certain privileges and obligations, but as a servant of Scotland itself, bound by duty to protect and preserve something precious that was in danger of being lost forever. The philosophy that would guide William through the trials ahead was shaped by everything he had learned and experienced up to this point. His father's teachings about the moral responsibilities of leadership, his education in Paris with its emphasis on justice and the common good, his years of working among ordinary people and understanding their hopes and fears. But it was also shaped by love for his homeland, love for his people, and love for ideals that seemed worth any sacrifice to preserve. As summer turned to autumn in 1296, William Wallace stood at a crossroads that would determine the rest of his life. He could choose the path of accommodation, like so many other Scottish nobles, accepting English rule in exchange for the preservation of his lands and status. Or he could choose the path of resistance, knowing that it would likely lead to his death, but hoping that it might also lead to his country's freedom. The choice, when it came, was easier than he had expected, for William had learned during his years of preparation that true leadership was not about making popular decisions or safe decisions, but about making necessary decisions regardless of their personal cost. The guardian within him was awakening, and with that awakening came a clarity of purpose that would sustain him through the darkness ahead. The personal cost of his decision became apparent almost immediately. His beloved, understanding what his choice would mean for both of them, accepted his proposal of marriage with the knowledge that their time together might be brief. They were wed in a small ceremony at her family's chapel, surrounded by a few close friends and family members who understood the significance of the moment. It was both the happiest and saddest day of William's life. Happy because he was united with the woman he loved. Sad because he knew their happiness existed in the shadow of coming conflict. Their brief marriage was like a calm pool in the midst of a raging torrent. For a few precious weeks, William allowed himself to believe that perhaps love and duty could coexist, that he might find a way to protect both his country and his personal happiness. But the illusion was shattered when English soldiers, acting on the orders of a local sheriff who had been offended by William's refusal to swear allegiance, killed his young wife in what was officially described as a tragic accident, but what everyone understood to be a deliberate act of intimidation. The murder of his beloved transformed William's philosophical commitment to resistance into something far more personal and immediate. The scholar who had once debated abstract questions of justice and legitimate authority now faced the most concrete question of all: whether he would allow evil to triumph through his inaction, or whether he would risk everything to ensure that such cruelty could never again go unpunished. The answer came not from his mind, but from his heart, and it would reshape the destiny of a nation. In the depths of winter, when the highland peaks wore crowns of snow and the lochs lay frozen beneath skies the color of pewter, William Wallace disappeared from the familiar world of his youth and entered the realm of legend. The transformation did not happen overnight, nor did it announce itself with fanfare and proclamations. Instead, it began quietly, in the hidden places where broken men go to heal their wounds, and where desperate men go to forge new purposes from the ashes of their shattered lives. The death of his beloved had torn something fundamental from William's soul, leaving him raw and bleeding in ways that no physical wound could match. For weeks after the funeral, he wandered the winter landscape like a man possessed, seeking solitude in the ancient forests where his ancestors had once hunted and where the old gods still seemed to whisper through the bare branches of oak and ash. Those who glimpsed him during this dark period spoke of seeing a figure more ghost than man, moving through the snow-covered wilderness with the purposeless determination of the truly lost. But grief, when it is deep enough and pure enough, can become a forge for transformation rather than destruction. Slowly, painfully, William began to understand that his personal loss was inseparable from the larger tragedy that had befallen his country. His beloved had died because Scottish law no longer protected Scottish people, because English administrators could act with impunity, knowing that no native authority remained to call them to account. Her death was both uniquely personal and tragically representative, a single bright life extinguished in the greater darkness that had settled over the land. It was in this recognition that William found his path forward. He could not bring back his wife, could not undo the injustice that had shattered his personal world, but he could ensure that her death would not be meaningless. He could dedicate what remained of his life to creating a Scotland where such cruelties would be impossible, where law meant protection rather than oppression, where the weak would be shielded by the strong rather than crushed beneath their heels. The first phase of William's resistance was marked by careful preparation rather than dramatic action. Drawing on the network of contacts he had built during his years as a mediator and problem solver, he began reaching out to men who shared his conviction that Scotland's submission to English rule was both temporary and intolerable. These early recruits were not the great magnates whose names filled the chronicles, but lesser men, younger sons of minor nobles, prosperous farmers, skilled craftsmen, even outlaws who had chosen the greenwood over submission. Each recruitment was a delicate dance of trust-building and conviction testing. William understood that the kind of resistance he envisioned would require men willing to sacrifice everything for an ideal that might not be realized in their lifetimes. He needed followers who were motivated by something deeper than personal ambition or temporary grievance, men who could sustain their commitment through the inevitable periods of defeat and despair that lay ahead. In these quiet conversations, often held in remote locations under the cover of darkness, William began to articulate a vision of Scottish independence that went beyond mere opposition to English rule. He spoke of a Scotland governed by its own laws for the benefit of its own people, where advancement would depend on merit rather than birth, where justice would be available to rich and poor alike. It was a revolutionary vision, informed by his studies in Paris but grounded in his understanding of Scottish character and tradition. "We do not fight merely to replace English masters with Scottish ones," he would tell his growing band of followers during their clandestine gatherings. "We fight to create something new, something worthy of the sacrifices it will require. Our victory, when it comes, must mean more than the simple expulsion of foreign soldiers from our soil. It must mean the birth of a nation that embodies the highest ideals of human governance and Christian virtue." The practical organization of this early resistance movement reflected William's understanding of both military strategy and human psychology. Rather than attempting to create a conventional army that could be easily detected and destroyed by English forces, he developed a network of small, independent groups that could operate autonomously while maintaining communication with the larger movement. Each group was responsible for a specific geographic area and was tasked with gathering intelligence, recruiting new members, and preparing for coordinated action when the time was right. Training was conducted in remote locations under the guise of hunting expeditions or religious retreats. William insisted that his followers master not only the traditional weapons of warfare, sword, spear, and bow, but also the newer techniques of guerrilla fighting that would allow smaller forces to prevail against larger, more heavily armed opponents. He drew lessons from his studies of Roman history, particularly the campaigns of Julius Caesar in Gaul, but adapted them to Scottish terrain and conditions. More important than military training, however, was the cultivation of the moral and spiritual discipline that would be necessary to sustain a long struggle against overwhelming odds. William understood that men could endure almost any hardship if they believed their cause was just and their sacrifice meaningful. He spent countless hours with his followers, discussing not only tactics and strategy, but the deeper questions of why they fought and what they hoped to achieve. These discussions often took on an almost mystical quality, particularly when they were held in locations that held special significance in Scottish tradition. Standing stones erected by ancient peoples became gathering places where William would speak of the continuity between past and present, of the obligation each generation owed to those who came before and those who would come after. Old battlefields where Scottish warriors had died defending their freedom became classrooms where the lessons of history were made immediate and personal. Every man who died at Mons Graupius, William would say, referring to the ancient battle where the Caledonii had fought the Romans, lives on in us if we prove worthy of their memory. Every woman who has mourned a son lost to foreign conquest will find her tears redeemed if we succeed in our purpose. We are not merely ourselves. We are the vessel through which the hopes and dreams of generations flow toward their fulfillment. As spring arrived in 1297, bringing with it the traditional season of campaigning, William sensed that the time for purely clandestine activity was drawing to a close. Intelligence gathered by his network indicated that English administrators were becoming increasingly harsh in their treatment of the Scottish population, perhaps hoping to crush any remaining spirit of independence through systematic oppression. New taxes were being imposed. Young Scottish men were being pressed into service in English armies, and any display of Scottish symbols or customs was being treated as an act of sedition. The catalyst for open resistance came, ironically, from an attempt by the English authorities to force William himself into a position of collaboration. Sheriff William Heselrigg of Lanark, either unaware of or unconcerned by William's growing influence, summoned him to the Shire court and demanded that he swear an oath of allegiance to Edward I. The summons was clearly intended as a test, a way of determining whether this troublesome young nobleman could be brought to heel or whether more drastic measures would be necessary. William's response was carefully calculated to achieve maximum symbolic impact. Rather than simply refusing to appear or sending word that he would not comply, he decided to attend the court session and deliver his answer in person. The decision was risky. He would be walking into the heart of English power in the region, surrounded by armed men loyal to the sheriff. But it was also an opportunity to make a statement that would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse in Lanark. On the appointed day, William Wallace entered the courthouse, accompanied by a small group of carefully chosen followers. They were lightly armed and outnumbered, but they carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who had already accepted the possibility of death in service to their cause. The tension in the crowded courtroom was palpable as Sheriff Heselrig called William forward and formally demanded his oath of allegiance to the English king. William's reply would be remembered and repeated for generations, not because of its eloquence, though it was eloquent, but because of the absolute conviction with which it was delivered. Standing straight and tall, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent courtroom, he spoke words that transformed him from a local troublemaker into a symbol of Scottish resistance. "I cannot and will not swear allegiance to a foreign king while my own country lies in chains," he said, each word falling like a hammer blow in the hushed chamber. "I owe my loyalty first to God, then to Scotland, and finally to any king who proves worthy of a free people's trust. Edward Plantagenet has shown himself to be a tyrant and a usurper, unworthy of the allegiance of any man who values honor above safety. Therefore, I defy him. I defy his representatives in this land, and I call upon every true Scot to join me in reclaiming what is rightfully ours." The words hung in the air for a moment that seemed to stretch toward eternity. Then Sheriff Heselrig, his face flushed with anger and perhaps fear, bellowed for his guards to seize the traitor. But William and his companions were already moving, their carefully rehearsed plan unfolding with deadly precision. In the violence that followed, Sheriff Heselrig was killed, his guards scattered or slain, and the symbols of English authority in Lanark were destroyed. The killing of Sheriff Heselrig was more than just an act of personal revenge. It was a declaration of war, a signal fire that would spread across Scotland and ignite the flames of general uprising. Within days, word of William's deed had reached every corner of the kingdom, carrying with it a simple but powerful message. Resistance was possible, English rule was not inevitable, and there was at least one man willing to risk everything for Scottish freedom. But William understood that a single dramatic gesture, however inspiring, would not be enough to sustain a national movement. The real work was just beginning, the slow, patient, dangerous work of building an army from nothing, of coordinating scattered acts of resistance into a coherent campaign, of transforming the dream of independence into practical military and political reality. As news of the uprising spread, men began to emerge from the forests and hidden places where they had been waiting for just such a moment. Some came alone, others in small groups, but all came with the same expression of desperate hope that William had seen in the eyes of his early followers. They looked to him not just for military leadership, but for the kind of moral authority that could justify the enormous risks they were taking and the sacrifices they would be called upon to make. William accepted this responsibility with the same grave determination that had characterized all his major decisions. He understood that he was no longer just William Wallace of Elderslie, no longer just a grieving widower seeking personal justice. He had become something larger and more symbolic, the embodiment of Scottish hope, the guardian of a dream that belonged not to him alone, but to every man, woman, and child who called Scotland home. The fire of justice that had been kindled in Lanark would soon spread across the length and breadth of Scotland, consuming the structures of foreign domination and clearing the ground for something new to grow. But William knew that fire was both creator and destroyer, and that the price of the freedom they sought would be higher than any of them could yet imagine. The easy part was over. Now the real test would begin. In the mists of early dawn, when the world seems suspended between night and day, between dream and waking, the figure of William Wallace takes on its truest form, not as the warrior of legend, frozen in a moment of triumph or defeat, but as the eternal guardian of ideals that transcend the boundaries of time and nation. For in the end, the measure of a man is not found in the battles he won or lost, but in the principles he lived by and the legacy he left for those who would follow. The years following the uprising at Lanark unfolded like a tragic poem, each stanza building toward an inevitable conclusion that everyone could sense but none could prevent. William's small band of rebels grew into an army, his local uprising became a national movement, and his personal quest for justice expanded into a struggle for the soul of a nation. Yet, through all these transformations, the essential character of the man remained unchanged. He was still the dreamy boy who had wandered the forests of Renfrewshire, still the earnest student who had debated philosophy in the halls of Paris, still the grieving lover who had chosen duty over safety. The victory at Stirling Bridge in the autumn of 1297 represented the high water mark of William's military career, but it was also the moment when he understood most clearly the terrible burden he had accepted. Standing on the field where English arrogance had met Scottish determination and been found wanting, surrounded by his jubilant followers who hailed him as the liberator of their homeland, William felt not triumph, but a profound sadness for all that had been lost, and all that would yet be sacrificed before their work was done. Victory is a harsh teacher, he confided to his closest companions in the quiet hours after the battle, as they sat around a modest fire and listened to the distant sounds of celebration from the Scottish camp. It shows us what is possible, but it also reveals how much more difficult the real work will be. Today we defeated an army, but tomorrow we must build a nation. Today we proved our courage, but tomorrow we must prove our wisdom. The months that followed Stirling Bridge were perhaps the most challenging of William's life, for they required him to transition from the role of rebel leader to that of national guardian. As Guardian of Scotland, the title formally bestowed upon him by what remained of the Scottish nobility, he bore responsibility not just for military strategy, but for the entire apparatus of government in a country struggling to rebuild itself from the ruins of conquest. William approached these administrative duties with the same moral seriousness that had characterized his military leadership. He established courts to dispense justice according to Scottish law rather than English dictate. He organized the collection of taxes to fund the continuing war effort while ensuring that the burden fell most heavily on those best able to bear it. He sent embassies to foreign courts, seeking recognition for Scottish independence and support for the Scottish cause. Perhaps most importantly, he worked to heal the divisions that had weakened Scotland before the English conquest. The great magnates, who had once competed for the throne, were gradually brought back into the national fold, their ambitions channeled toward the common goal of independence rather than personal aggrandizement. Highland clans that had remained aloof from lowland politics were convinced to join the broader struggle. Even the Church, which had initially been reluctant to openly oppose English rule, began to provide both moral and material support for the Scottish cause. But William's greatest achievement during his brief tenure as Guardian was not administrative or diplomatic, but inspirational. Through his words and actions, he gave ordinary Scots a vision of what their country could become, not just an independent nation, but a just nation, a place where ancient ideals of honor and community could flourish in the modern world. He spoke of Scotland not as a collection of competing interests held together by geographical boundaries, but as a community of shared values and common purpose. We are not fighting for the right to be governed badly by our own people rather than well by foreigners, he declared in one of his most memorable speeches to a gathering of nobles and commoners in the ruins of Scone Abbey. We are fighting for the right to govern ourselves according to our own understanding of justice and righteousness. We seek not merely independence, but the independence to build something worthy of the sacrifices it has required. The disaster at Falkirk in the summer of 1298 shattered this dream as completely as a stone thrown through glass. Edward I, learning from his earlier defeat, had assembled an army that combined the best elements of medieval warfare, heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and the devastating new weapon of massed archery. Against such a force, even the finest Scottish courage proved insufficient, and William's army was destroyed in a single catastrophic afternoon. The aftermath of Falkirk revealed both the greatness and the limitations of William's character. Rather than attempting to shift blame to others or to minimize his own responsibility for the defeat, he accepted full accountability for the disaster. He resigned his position as Guardian, acknowledging that new leadership was needed for the different challenges that lay ahead. Most tellingly, he refused to abandon the struggle despite having every reason to do so. A man may fail in his duty without being released from it, he explained to those who urged him to flee to safety in France or Norway, kingdoms where his reputation as a military commander would have ensured him a welcome reception and a comfortable exile. I swore an oath to serve Scotland's cause, not to Edward Plantagenet or to any earthly monarch, but to the ideal of Scottish freedom itself, and that oath was not conditional upon success or survival. I will continue to serve in whatever capacity I can, for as long as I am able, until death releases me from my obligation or until Scotland is truly free. This is not stubbornness or pride, but simple recognition of what honor requires when honor is all that remains. The years that followed Falkirk were marked by a different kind of struggle, the slow, grinding campaign of guerrilla warfare that gradually wore down English resources and resolve while extracting a terrible price from the Scottish people, who found themselves caught between competing armies and conflicting loyalties. William remained active in this resistance, but his role had changed from that of supreme commander to something more like an elder statesman, offering counsel and inspiration to a new generation of leaders, while younger men took on the primary responsibility for military operations. Robert the Bruce, John Comyn, and other magnates who had previously held themselves aloof from the independence struggle now found themselves drawn into the conflict, partly by circumstance and partly by the example William had set of placing principle above personal interest. During this period of continued but diminished resistance, William had many opportunities to reflect on the course of his life and the nature of the cause he served, to consider the price of the choices he had made and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. In quiet moments between campaigns, when the immediate pressures of survival and organization briefly relaxed their grip, he would often return to his childhood haunts in Renfrewshire, walking the same paths he had explored as a boy, but seeing them now through eyes that had witnessed both the heights and depths of human experience. The ancient forests seemed to offer him a kind of peace that he could find nowhere else, reminding him that the struggle for justice was older than any individual participant and would continue long after all of them had returned to dust. It was during one of these solitary walks along a stream where he had once built dams as a child and dreamed of redirecting its flow towards some more perfect destination, that William first articulated what would become his final understanding of his own role in the great drama of Scottish independence. Speaking to a small group of his most trusted followers who had accompanied him on this journey into memory, he explained his growing conviction that his greatest service to the cause might not be military victory, but symbolic witness, not the achievement of immediate goals, but the preservation of ideals that others could eventually realize. Every movement needs its martyrs as much as its heroes, he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom as he gazed across the peaceful landscape that had shaped his earliest understanding of what was worth defending. Heroes inspire us to attempt great things, showing us what is possible when courage and skill are combined with favorable circumstances. But martyrs inspire us to persist when those attempts fail, demonstrating that some principles are worth dying for, regardless of whether that death achieves its immediate purpose. I begin to think that my destiny is not to see our victory, but to ensure through my sacrifice that others will never forget what that victory should mean when it finally comes. The capture that came in August 1305 was not unexpected. William had been living on borrowed time for years, moving through an increasingly hostile landscape where English gold had turned former friends into informants and safe havens into traps. The network of support that had once sustained him had been systematically dismantled through a combination of military pressure and financial inducement, leaving him increasingly isolated and vulnerable to betrayal. Yet, even as the net closed around him, even as he understood that escape was no longer possible and that his enemies were finally closing in for the kill, he made no attempt to flee to the continent or to negotiate some face-saving compromise that might have spared his life. Instead, he chose to face his fate with the same unwavering commitment to principle that had defined his entire adult life, the same refusal to compromise with evil that had first led him to take up arms against English rule. The trial in Westminster Hall was a foregone conclusion, a piece of political theatre designed not to determine guilt or innocence, but to provide legal justification for what Edward I had already decided must happen. The charges brought against William, treason, murder, arson, and sacrilege, were carefully crafted to paint him not as a legitimate military commander fighting for his country's freedom, but as a common criminal whose actions had placed him outside the protection of both human and divine law. The proceedings followed the established forms of English jurisprudence, with witnesses called to testify and evidence presented in proper order, but the outcome had been determined before the first word was spoken. William's refusal to plead guilty to treason against a king he had never acknowledged created a moment of pure moral clarity that transcended the sordid political calculations of his accusers and elevated the entire proceeding to a level of symbolic significance that none of the participants had originally intended. Standing before his judges with dignity intact despite the chains that bound his hands and the certain knowledge of the fate that awaited him, he spoke words that would echo through the centuries, long after the names of his tormentors had been forgotten. "I cannot be a traitor to Edward," he declared with quiet dignity that seemed to fill the great hall with its moral authority, "for I was never his subject, never swore him allegiance, never accepted his claim to rule over the free people of Scotland. I am and have always been a faithful servant of my true sovereign, not any earthly king, but the people of Scotland themselves, and their rightful claim to govern themselves according to their own laws and customs. If this be treason, then I am guilty of it, and proud to be so, for it is a treason that places loyalty to principle above, submission to power, devotion to justice, above acceptance of oppression." The execution that followed was designed to serve as a warning to anyone who might consider following William's example, a spectacle of calculated cruelty that would demonstrate to the world the ultimate futility of resistance against English power. The elaborate tortures inflicted upon his body, the drawing through the streets, the hanging that stopped just short of death, the disembowelment while still conscious, the dismemberment and beheading, were meant to destroy not just the man, but the idea he represented, to show that even the most heroic resistance would end in ignominious suffering. But those who orchestrated this spectacle of suffering fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man they were destroying and the cause he represented, the way that symbols can become more powerful in death than they ever were in life. For William Wallace had long since ceased to be merely an individual seeking personal goals, and had become instead the living embodiment of an idea, the idea that a people's right to freedom was worth any sacrifice to preserve and defend, that dignity was more valuable than life, that some principles were so fundamental that they transcended the ordinary calculations of benefit and cost. The destruction of his mortal form could not touch this idea. Indeed, it could only serve to give it greater power and permanence, transforming a defeated rebel leader into an immortal symbol of resistance to oppression. In death, William achieved what he had been unable to accomplish in life. He became truly immortal, not in body, but in spirit, not as a historical figure, but as an enduring inspiration. The story of William Wallace might have ended there, with his death on a scaffold in Smithfield, his body torn apart by executioners who believed they were destroying not just a man but a symbol, his name consigned to the dusty pages of chronicles that few would read and fewer still would remember. But stories like his never truly end, they simply transform, taking new forms in each generation as new guardians arise to carry forward the eternal struggle between freedom and oppression, between justice and power, between the individual conscience and the demands of the state. The seeds of his sacrifice took root in soil watered by the blood of martyrs and grew into forests of inspiration that would shelter freedom fighters for centuries to come. And oppression, between justice and power, between the individual conscience and the demands of the state. In the months and years that followed William's execution, his example inspired a new generation of Scottish leaders who ultimately achieved the independence he had died for. Robert the Bruce, John Barber, and countless unnamed heroes drew strength from William's sacrifice, finding in his memory the courage to persist when their own faith wavered. The victory at Bannockburn, the Declaration of Arbroath, and the eventual recognition of Scottish independence were all, in their way, vindications of the principles William had lived and died to defend. But the true legacy of William Wallace extends far beyond the specific struggle for Scottish independence. In an age when most men accepted without question the divine right of kings and the natural order of feudal hierarchy, he dared to suggest that political authority should be based on consent rather than conquest, that justice should be available to all rather than reserved for the privileged few, that a people's right to self-determination was worth any sacrifice to preserve. These ideas, which seemed so radical in the 13th century, would eventually become the foundation stones of modern democracy. The American revolutionaries, who declared that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, were echoing principles that William Wallace had articulated 5 centuries earlier. The French revolutionaries, who proclaimed the rights of man, were giving voice to ideals that had been kept alive by martyrs like William through the long centuries of absolutist rule. Even today, in our own troubled times, the figure of William Wallace continues to inspire those who struggle against oppression and injustice. Not the Hollywood version of the man, that cartoonish figure of impossible heroics and anachronistic romance, but the real William Wallace, the thoughtful scholar who chose to become a warrior, the grieving lover who transformed personal loss into universal cause, the practical idealist who understood that some dreams are worth dying for because they are the only dreams worth living for. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about William Wallace is not that he was willing to die for his principles, but that he was able to live them so completely. From his youth in the peaceful countryside of Renfrewshire to his final moments on the scaffold in London, he remained true to the vision of justice and human dignity that had been planted in his heart by loving parents and nurtured by years of study and reflection. He never compromised with evil, never accepted that injustice was inevitable, never stopped believing that a better world was possible if good men were willing to fight for it. This is the true meaning of guardianship, not the defense of borders or the preservation of institutions, but the protection of ideals that give life meaning and purpose. William Wallace was the guardian of Scotland, but more than that, he was the guardian of the human aspiration for freedom, dignity, and justice. In that sense, he belongs not just to Scotland, but to all humanity, not just to the 13th century, but to every age that produces men and women brave enough to stand up and say, "This far and no farther." As we close this tale of William Wallace, the eternal guardian, let us remember that his story is not finished. It continues in every person who chooses principle over convenience, who stands with the oppressed against the oppressor, who believes that the arc of history can be bent toward justice by those willing to grasp it with their own hands. The boy who once dreamed by Scottish locks became a man who changed the world. The scholar who debated philosophy in Paris became the warrior who embodied those philosophies in action. The guardian who died for Scotland became the inspiration for freedom-loving people everywhere. His voice still echoes across the centuries, calling to each new generation, "Remember who you are. Remember what you owe to those who came before and those who will come after. Remember that some things are worth more than life itself, and that the guardians of those things can never truly die. In the gentle hills of Scotland, where morning mist still clings to ancient oaks, and the wind still carries whispers of old dreams, William Wallace continues his eternal watch, not as a ghost haunting the past, but as a presence guiding the future, reminding us all that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the greatest victory is not conquering others, but conquering our own fears and limitations in service to something greater than ourselves. Sleep well and dream of a world where guardians like William Wallace are no longer needed, because the ideals they died for have finally triumphed. But sleep lightly, for until that day comes, we are all called to be guardians in our own way, protectors of the flame that William Wallace helped kindle, and that must never be allowed to die.